Chapter 38. Skye. When Dylan sent Skye and Jesse off, he was sure they'd be safer in the woods than beside him. He'd kept one eye on them as they started their race across the empty parking lot and huffed out a breath of relief when they appeared safe. Gunfire raged around Dylan. Once Gregory ordered the firing to start, he didn't let up. Dylan and his men spent most of the time cowering behind the cars. Kurt shrieked when a bullet caught him in the leg. Every time Dylan got the chance, he fired Gregory's way. Once he heard a yell and hoped one enemy went down. The gunfire from the other side slowed, and Dylan's men got their chance. But mid-blast to the enemy, Wade caught Dylan's attention. Dylan glanced back to see Skye and Jesse running into the woods with 4 men on their tail. Dylan's heart slammed against his ribcage. For a second, he froze. A bullet buzzed past his head, startling him back to the fight. Anger and fear mixed, fueling Dylan's aggression. He was ferocious, determined to get this done. The woman and boy needed him. The shots became more sporadic as bullets ran low. Dylan raced around the car to tackle one of Gregory's men. He pulled him to the ground, pummeling him. When that man was no longer a threat, Dylan went to the next. This one had more fire in him. He got the upper hand and rolled Dylan, bashing his head against the pavement. Dylan grunted with each hit but pushed his way back up. Dylan pushed the man back against a car and slammed his fist into his face. He didn't let up until the man was reeling. Dylan looked to the woods as he wiped the blood from his face. Shaking out a hand, Wade joined Dylan. Aaron lay on the concrete groaning from a beating he had taken. The Coles tied the last of Gregory's men and told Kurt and Aaron to watch the 4 of them. Dylan reloaded his crossbow, then he and Wade bolted across the parking lot. Dylan's blood ran cold when he heard Jesse's angry, desperate scream. They raced to the edge of the concrete and found 2 of Gregory's men on the ground, dead. Dylan and Wade exchanged a sober glance and headed into the woods. The enemy hadn't bothered to hide their trail, so following them would have been easy, even if Skye and Jesse hadn't deliberately left evidence of the way they had taken. An anguished yell from Skye urged them along. Another screech from Jesse sent a shudder through Dylan. The men flew through the forest. They shoved past brambles pulling at their clothing and vaulted over rotted fallen trees. A single thought drove them, to save the ones they loved, no matter the cost. As they neared the edge of a small glen, Dylan scoured the scene through the trees. Skye stood alone, her shoulder and arm at an awkward angle, but straight and tall as possible. Dylan had never been more proud and more terrified in his entire life. A large man held Jesse from going to her. But the boy was a whirl of limbs as he fought the big man with everything he had. 2 other men stood across from Skye, one with a gun. The other was Frankie. Dylan groaned. All this Dylan took in as he rushed toward Skye, only a few yards to go. The man across from Skye spoke, a bullet exploding from the gun he held. Skye put a hand to her middle, looked at Frankie and dropped. Dylan halted, stunned. Shook to the core, he hardly noticed the shot that took down Frankie. His legs refused to move, his lungs unable to take in oxygen. A roar rose from a place Dylan didn't know existed. He stared at his love, the brightness of his life, as she lay broken, so pale, and covered in blood. He watched her release a sigh, and go still, so very still. Dylan's vision narrowed to the man with the gun. He plunged ahead, picking up speed until he broke free from the forest. Dylan released the rage he continuously held at bay and let it run unchecked, adding the agony of Skye's death to the wrath that already lived within him. Dylan felt the heat move over him, would not have been surprised if his breath became fire. Wade breathed heavy at his side, but Dylan wanted this for himself. He pulled ahead. A swipe at Pete's skull with the hard crossbow had the big man staggering and holding his head. Dylan knew he could leave the rest to Wade. Frankie was already down with a bullet to the head. Tony moaned in the background. Dylan moved on to Calvin. Fear washed over Calvin's face as an enraged Dylan came at him. He stumbled backward, his eyes stretching larger and larger as Dylan closed in on him. Calvin lifted a shaking gun at Dylan. Dylan aimed his crossbow and fired, hitting the arm in which Calvin held the gun. His target cried out, dropping the weapon and grabbing at the arrow. Dylan lunged at Calvin, fists pounding, even as the man apologized for every single wicked thing he had done his entire life. Dylan's head whirred with rage. Still, Calvin's confession got through. Slaughters and unimaginable cruelties spilled from the man as if his admission would stop Dylan's fists. It wasn't only Skye, his own beautiful Skye, that suffered at this madman's hands. There were others. Wade appeared, pulling at Dylan. "No. He needs to die," Dylan said through gritted teeth. "She ain't dead," Wade said. "I know he does, but Skye ain't dead." Dylan released the balled-up chunk of Calvin's shirt he held and let him drop. He stared over his shoulder at her. He was afraid that on this surreal day, this was the part that was not real. Shirtless, Jesse pressed his t-shirt to Skye's bullet wound. The boy kept calling out to her, hoping she would wake up. "Keep them all down," Dylan said, his voice curt. "If they move, shoot them dead." Wade nodded and pulled a whimpering Calvin closer to Pete. Dylan hurried to Skye. Blood covered her middle, her face ran down her arms. He moved to gather Skye in his arms but stopped, worried he would hurt her more. She looked so small. Dylan swallowed the sobs trying to escape. Skye may be alive now, but she wouldn't be for long. He planted a foot on each side of Skye and bent to check her pulse. Some of the tension left him. It was stronger than Dylan expected. Dylan waved at Jesse's hands and gently pulled back the shirt pressed against her wound. The knot inside Dylan tightened. The position of the injury alarmed him. Skye needed more than them. To recover she needed a hospital, a doctor. "Help her, Dylan," Jesse pleaded. Dylan looked at the boy's scared face, knowing it reflected his own. How did he tell the boy maybe no one could? A rustling came from the bushes to their right, and a black look settled over Dylan's face. He stood and loaded his crossbow. Beside him, Wade did the same. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. That way I'll know to post more chapters.